The ancient stones of the Charles Bridge had stood for 6 centuries, surviving wars, floods, and the relentless march of time. Garrick knew every microfracture in its arches, treating the historical structure with more tenderness than he had shown his own marriage lately. The damp Prague fog clung to his heavy coat as he unlocked the door to the project's observational apartment, holding 2 cups of black coffee. He had come to surprise his wife, Leora, the brilliant urban planner managing the district's renovation. Instead, the surprise was his. Through the crack of the bedroom door, the rhythmic creaking of the floorboards and the unmistakable, breathless whispers of Leora entangled with another man paralyzed him. He didn't shout. He didn't break the door down. He just stood there in the cold shadows, watching his reality fracture faster than the ancient stone outside. If the dark, hidden corners of human relationships and the chilling price of betrayal speak to your soul, stay with me. This is a story of a love that didn't just fade, but was violently dismantled, piece by piece. The Charles Bridge was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, a spine of stone and mortar connecting the 2 halves of Prague over the dark, rushing waters of the Vltava River. To the tourists, it was a Gothic romance. To Garrick, it was a mathematical equation of load paths, stress distribution, and time. He ran his gloved hand over the damp sandstone of a supporting arch, feeling the deep, jagged fissure that had become his obsession for the past 6 months. It's widening, he murmured to himself, his breath pluming in the freezing November air. The structural integrity was compromised. It needed urgent reinforcement. Garrick checked his watch. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. His wife, Leora, the lead urban planner coordinating the city's side of the restoration, was supposed to be working out of the temporary observational apartment the city had rented near the bridgehead. They had barely seen each other in weeks. Their marriage, now 7 years old, had slowly morphed into a polite cohabitation. They spoke in the language of blueprints, budgets, and schedules. The passion had eroded, much like the stone beneath his fingers, but Garrick still believed in the foundation. He believed they could fix it. He decided to take a break. He bought 2 cups of bitter espresso from a street vendor and walked toward the apartment building. He had the spare key in his heavy wool coat. The plan was simple. Bring her coffee, force her to look away from her laptop for 10 minutes, and perhaps remind her of the man she had married. The stairwell of the old building smelled of dust and damp wood. Garrick climbed to the 3rd floor, his heavy boots making soft thuds against the runner rug. He reached the door of apartment 3B. He didn't knock. He wanted to see her face light up in surprise. He slid the brass key into the lock and turned it with a soft click. The apartment was warm, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the gray afternoon light. The scent of Leora's expensive jasmine perfume hung heavy in the air, but beneath it was something else. A sharp, unfamiliar cologne. Leora, he called out softly, keeping his voice low in case she was on a conference call. There was no answer, but a sound drifted from the half-open bedroom door down the narrow hallway. It was a rhythmic, muffled thudding, accompanied by the rustle of heavy cotton sheets. Garrick froze. The coffee cups in his hands suddenly felt like lead weights. The silence of the apartment was suffocating, broken only by a soft, breathless moan that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. He didn't want to step forward. Every instinct screaming in his scientific, rational brain told him to turn around and walk out. But his feet moved on their own, drawing him toward the sliver of light spilling from the bedroom. Through the 3-inch gap, he saw them. Leora, his beautiful, brilliant wife, her dark hair tangled against the white pillows. Her eyes were closed, her head thrown back in a portrait of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. Above her, driving into her with urgent, aggressive force, was Julian. Julian, the wealthy real estate developer funding half of the bridge project. The man who had shaken Garrick's hand just yesterday, praising his structural designs. Garrick didn't burst through the door. He didn't scream or throw the hot coffee. He experienced a strange, terrifying detachment. His mind, trained to analyze structural failures, simply documented the scene. The clothes discarded hastily on the floor. Leora's hand clutching Julian's shoulder. The way she whispered his name, a sound she hadn't made for Garrick in years. He watched for exactly 30 seconds. Then, carefully, silently, Garrick took a step back. He set the 2 cups of coffee perfectly side by side on the hallway console table, right next to Leora's keys. A silent message. He let himself out, the lock clicking shut behind him. When he stepped back onto the cobblestone streets of Prague, the fog seemed to swallow him whole. His heart wasn't just broken, it was violently hollowed out, making room for something much darker. The walk back to their Vinohrady apartment was a blur of gray cobblestones and biting wind. Garrick did not remember unlocking the door or shrugging off his heavy wool coat. He only registered the suffocating silence of their home, a sprawling, minimalist space they had designed together during the 2nd year of their marriage. Back then, the clean lines and stark white walls had felt modern, a canvas for their future. Now, the apartment felt like a sterile laboratory, devoid of warmth or life. He poured himself a glass of neat bourbon, the amber liquid burning a trail down his throat, grounding him in his physical body while his mind threatened to sever completely. He sat in the leather armchair by the window, the city lights of Prague beginning to flicker to life against the encroaching dusk. He waited. He became an architect of his own silence, building a fortress around the raw, bleeding wound in his chest. At 6:30, the front door clicked open. Leora stepped inside, bringing the chill of the evening with her. "Garrick? You're home early," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the hallway. It was the same voice, the same cadence she used to order groceries or discuss zoning laws. The same voice he had heard hours ago, breathless and broken, echoing from a cheap hotel-style mattress. "Just wrapping up some structural reports," Garrick replied. He was surprised by how steady he sounded. His voice was a perfectly constructed facade, bearing the load of his shattering reality without a single visible crack. Leora walked into the living room. She looked impeccable. Her dark hair was neatly pinned back, her tailored charcoal blazer devoid of a single wrinkle. There was no flush to her cheeks, no lingering scent of cheap cologne, no visible mark of the betrayal she had committed just hours prior. She was a masterclass in deception. She leaned down and pressed a soft, dry kiss to his cheek. "I'm exhausted," she sighed, sinking onto the sofa opposite him and slipping off her heels. "Julian kept us in a budgetary meeting all afternoon. The man is relentless about the timeline for the bridge." The lie slipped past her lips with terrifying ease. Garrick stared at her, his eyes tracing the delicate line of her jaw. He imagined the mechanics of her jaw moving, the acoustic waves of the lie traveling through the air. "Julian kept us in a meeting." "A meeting? Is that so?" Garrick asked, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. "Did you manage to reach an understanding?" "Eventually," she said, massaging her temples. "But it took everything out of me. Let's just order in tonight. Thai. Or maybe that Italian place near the square." "Thai is fine," he said quietly. The evening unfolded in a grotesque parody of their domestic life. They sat at the glass dining table, passing containers of pad thai and speaking of meaningless things. Garrick found himself analyzing every micro-expression on her face. When she smiled, did it reach her eyes? When she reached for her water glass, were her fingers trembling with residual adrenaline? He was looking for a fracture, a sign of guilt, a microscopic tell that the woman sitting across from him was carrying a secret heavy enough to crush them both. But there was nothing. Leora was perfectly, seamlessly normal. This was the true horror, Garrick realized as he pushed the noodles around his plate. It wasn't just the physical act of the affair that destroyed him. It was the realization that he did not know the woman he had married. If she could look him in the eye, eat dinner with him, and complain about the man she had just been intimately entwined with, then their entire marriage was a construct built on quicksand. "You're quiet tonight," Leora noted, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth. Her dark eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, softened with feigned concern. "Are you worried about the arch reinforcements?" "Yes," Garrick lied smoothly, looking directly into her eyes. "There's a deep structural weakness in the core. It looks fine on the surface, but underneath, the foundation is completely rotten. If we aren't careful, the whole thing is going to collapse." Leora frowned, taking his metaphor entirely literally. Well, that's why you're the best engineer in Prague. You'll figure out how to fix it. I will, Garrick said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that she failed to notice. I know exactly what needs to be done. The morning fog over the Vltava River was thick enough to swallow the opposite bank, leaving the city in a muted, gray isolation. Garrick sat at a small, iron-wrought table in the corner of a quiet riverside cafe, his hands wrapped around a porcelain cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The establishment belonged to Imelda, Julian's wife. Unlike Leora, who commanded every room with sharp angles and relentless ambition, Imelda moved through her cafe with a quiet, almost melancholic grace. She was a woman painted in soft watercolors, her pale blonde hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, wearing a simple cashmere sweater that swallowed her slight frame. She wiped down the espresso machine, arranged fresh pastries in the glass display, and offered warm, genuine smiles to the few early morning patrons seeking refuge from the Prague chill. Garrick watched her with the clinical precision of a man calculating structural stress. He was looking for the invisible cracks in her foundation. Did she know? Did she suspect that her husband, the magnate who had purchased the heavy, flawless diamond resting on her left hand, spent his afternoons tearing the clothes off another man's wife? As he observed her, the answer became agonizingly clear. She was completely oblivious. There was a profound, tragic innocence in the way she hummed to the soft jazz playing over the speakers. She was a woman securely anchored in a reality that had already ceased to exist. Garrick pressed his thumb against the edge of his table. The silence of his secret was a physical weight pressing against his lungs, threatening to crush his ribs. He thought of Leora lying beside him in bed last night, her breathing even and calm, while he stared at the ceiling, replaying the sounds from the apartment over and over until he felt he was losing his mind. He could not carry this alone. The architectural blueprint of his sanity required a counterweight. Imelda picked up a fresh pot of coffee and began making her rounds. When she reached Garrick's corner, she paused, her soft blue eyes reflecting a polite concern. "You haven't touched your cup," she noted, her voice a gentle, melodic contrast to the harshness of Garrick's internal world. "Is the brew too bitter today, Garrick? I can make you a fresh one." "The coffee is fine, Imelda." "Thank you," Garrick replied, his voice raspy from a night of zero sleep. He looked up at her, really looked at her. He saw the faint exhaustion under her eyes, the hallmark of a woman married to a man who was entirely consumed by his work, or so she believed. "You look like you are carrying the weight of the entire bridge on your shoulders." She offered a sympathetic smile, resting her hand lightly on the back of the empty chair opposite him. "Julian tells me the renovation is demanding, but you must remember to breathe. Stone can wait. People cannot." The mention of Julian's name from her lips felt like a physical blow. The irony was a jagged pill. Her husband was tearing down Garrick's life, and here she was, offering him comfort. A fierce, dark resolve crystallized in Garrick's chest. The moral compass that had guided his 35 years of life quietly shattered, replaced by a cold, mathematical need for equilibrium. He realized then that he was not going to protect Imelda. Misery did not just love company. In this case, it demanded a partnership. To dismantle the empire Julian and Leora thought they controlled, he needed the one person who had inside access to Julian's life. "Imelda," Garrick said, his tone shifting into something heavier, anchoring her to the spot. "Do you have 10 minutes to sit down? There is something regarding Julian's schedule that we need to discuss." Imelda hesitated for a fraction of a second before untying her linen apron. She gestured toward the small, glass-paneled office at the back of the cafe, a private sanctuary away from the morning rush. The room smelled of roasted beans and old paper. Garrick stepped inside, closing the door firmly, cutting off the soft jazz and the murmur of patrons. The sudden silence felt heavy, expectant, like the air right before a support beam snaps under too much pressure. "What is this about, Garrick?" Imelda asked, taking a seat behind her small mahogany desk. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her pale blue eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Is Julian facing financial trouble with the bridge? He has been terribly stressed lately. Coming home late, distracted. He isn't stressed about the bridge, Imelda, Garrick said softly. He sat in the chair opposite her, leaning forward slightly. He didn't want to do this, yet the dark, hollowed-out space inside him demanded it. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his phone. He placed it on the desk between them, sliding it toward her. On the screen was a photograph he had taken from across the street the previous afternoon. It showed Julian's unmistakable charcoal Bentley parked outside the unremarkable gray facade of the city-rented apartment building. Julian told you he was in back-to-back budget meetings yesterday afternoon, Garrick stated, his voice devoid of inflection. It was a statement of fact, a data point in his terrible equation. Leora told me the exact same thing. Imelda stared at the screen, a delicate frown creasing her forehead. I don't understand. Why is his car parked there? Is that the site office? No. It's a temporary apartment meant for the engineering team to rest during night shifts, Garrick explained, the words tasting like ash. I went there to surprise Leora with coffee. I had a key. He watched the exact moment the realization struck her. It wasn't a dramatic gasp or a flood of tears. It was a quiet, devastating inward collapse. The color drained completely from Imelda's face, leaving her skin the shade of old parchment. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat as her eyes darted from the phone to Garrick's unmoving expression. She was a smart woman. She didn't need him to draw a diagram of what he had found behind that door. Are you absolutely certain? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the small refrigerator in the corner. Perhaps they were just reviewing documents. I stood outside the bedroom. Imelda? Garrick said, the brutal honesty slicing through the last of her defenses. I heard them. I saw them. There was no paperwork. Imelda closed her eyes. A single tremor violently shook her shoulders, and she brought a trembling hand to her mouth. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the office was the ragged, shallow intake of her breath. Garrick did not reach out to comfort her. Comfort was a lie. He sat there and let the pain do its work, let the acid of the betrayal burn away the soft, naive edges of the woman sitting across from him. When Imelda finally opened her eyes, the melancholic softness that usually defined her was gone. It had been replaced by something glacial and brittle. The tears had pooled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice steadying into a cold, flat register. You could have divorced her quietly. You could have walked away. Because walking away leaves them with everything, Garrick replied, leaning closer, the dark gravity of his intent pulling her in. They are dismantling our lives while smiling at us over dinner. They think we are fools. I don't want to just walk away, Imelda. I want to tear down the very foundation they are standing on. Julian's reputation, Leora's career, the bridge, everything they value. Imelda stared at the photograph of the Bentley one last time. She reached out and deliberately turned the phone face down on the desk. When she looked back at Garrick, the shattered wife was gone. In her place sat a woman who had just realized she had nothing left to lose. Tell me what you need me to do, she whispered. The conference room of the city planning office felt like a mausoleum of white light and glass. Spread across the massive oak table were the sprawling blueprints of the Charles Bridge, a chaotic web of load paths, stress vectors, and historical preservation zones. Leora stood over them, a sleek silver pen in her hand, tapping rhythmically against the section detailing the central arch. Garrick watched her from the opposite side of the table. She was in her element, commanding, sharp, and utterly confident. The jasmine scent of her perfume mingled with the sterile smell of freshly printed paper. It was sickeningly domestic in a professional sense. They had built their entire reputation on moments like this, two brilliant minds working in perfect, undisputed synchronization. Julian's investors are getting restless, Leora said, her eyes scanning the budget columns. She did not look up at him. They want the pedestrian walkways reopened by the summer solstice gala. If we stick to your current curing schedule for the core foundational resin, we miss that deadline by 3 months. The city council will have my head, Garrick. The stone needs time to bond, Leora. It's a 600-year-old structure, not a modern overpass, Garrick replied, his tone perfectly measured, offering the expected amount of professional resistance. I know the physics, Garrick, she sighed, finally looking up. Her dark eyes held a flicker of exhaustion, a subtle plea for him to make her life easier. But Julian is threatening to pull the secondary funding tier if we don't accelerate. Is there any margin? Any alternative material? There it was. The opening. The microscopic crack in the armor, driven by her desperate need to appease the man she was sleeping with. Garrick stepped closer to the table. He reached out, his hand hovering over the blueprint, his sleeve brushing against hers. He felt the phantom heat of her skin, a sudden, violently intrusive memory of the hotel apartment flashing behind his eyes. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat and tapped a specific cross-section of the pier. There is an alternative, Garrick said slowly, his voice dropping into a register of reluctant compromise. We could utilize a rapid-setting polymer matrix for the secondary fissures. It cures in a quarter of the time and allows us to shift the bulk of Julian's capital toward the cosmetic restoration of the upper masonry right now. You get your pedestrian walkway by the solstice. Leora's face brightened, the tension melting from her shoulders. Why didn't you suggest this earlier? Because the rapid polymer is exorbitant in cost, Garrick lied smoothly, looking directly into her eyes. And while it holds the static load perfectly, its long-term resistance to riverborne kinetic vibration is less documented. It requires a massive upfront investment from Julian's firm to secure the sheer volume we'd need from the suppliers in Germany. Julian can handle the cost. He has the liquidity, Leora said dismissively, already scribbling notes in the margins of her planner. She was so eager to deliver a victory to her lover that she was completely ignoring the fundamental rule of structural engineering. Never trade stability for speed. I'll draft the proposal for the budget reallocation. You update the structural safety reports to reflect the new material. I'll have the revised schematics and the safety sign-offs on your desk by tomorrow morning, Garrick said. He watched her gather her things, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought she had expertly navigated her husband into clearing a path for her lover's financial success. As the glass door closed behind her, Garrick remained alone in the cold conference room. He looked down at the blueprints. The rapid-setting polymer would indeed pass the initial stress tests, satisfying the city inspectors. But Garrick knew the specific resonance of the Vltava River's winter currents. Within 6 months, the polymer would turn brittle. The cosmetic upper masonry would hold, masking the decay below, until the internal stress reached a critical mass. By shifting Julian's millions into the cosmetic phase, Garrick was bleeding the developer dry, ensuring there would be no reserve funds when the catastrophic failure finally registered on the sensors. Leora, as the lead planner who pushed the timeline and authorized the budget shift, would bear the full legal brunt of the city's wrath. He picked up his pen and began to falsify the safety margins. He was no longer building a bridge. He was engineering a guillotine. The heavy rain outside Imelda's apartment drummed against the window panes, a relentless percussion that swallowed the city noises of Prague. The interior was dimly lit by a single amber lamp, casting long, wavering shadows across the antique Persian rug. Garrick sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, a glass of untouched wine resting on the side table. He was exhausted. The meticulous falsification of the bridge's structural reports earlier that day had drained him of everything but a cold, hollow adrenaline. Imelda emerged from the kitchen, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. She looked ethereal in the low light, dressed in a simple silk robe that clung to the slight curves of her frame. Her face, usually so composed and softly melancholic, now bore the sharp edges of a woman living on the precipice. She set the mugs down and sank onto the sofa beside him, the distance between them practically non-existent. Julian transferred the first installment for the German polymer this afternoon, Imelda said, her voice a quiet murmur against the sound of the rain. 3 million euros. He didn't even read the secondary clauses I drafted into the account transfers. He was so eager to please Leora's timeline. Garrick turned his head to look at her. The scent of chamomile and something faintly metallic, perhaps the raw, nervous energy radiating from her, filled the small space. "He's blinded by his own arrogance," Garrick replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He thinks he's bought himself a monument and a mistress." Imelda let out a small, bitter laugh that sounded more like a dry sob. She reached out, her fingertips lightly brushing the cuff of Garrick's shirt. "We are destroying them," she said, her eyes searching his face, looking for the same fractured reflection she saw in the mirror every morning. "I never thought I was capable of this. I never thought I could sit across from him at breakfast, knowing I am actively dismantling his life." "You are surviving, Imelda," Garrick said softly, his own hand moving instinctively to cover hers. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp contrast to the cold calculation that had consumed them both. Her skin was warm, trembling slightly beneath his touch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her breath ghosting over the line of his jaw. "Survival feels a lot like dying," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut as she rested her forehead against his shoulder. The silence in the room thickened, transforming from shared grief into something far more dangerous. Garrick felt the violent thudding of his own heart. He thought of Leora, of the empty, sterile perfection of their marriage, of the brutal image of her tangled with Julian in that cheap apartment. Then he looked at Imelda, broken, beautiful, and bound to him by the darkest secret of their lives. Without a word, Garrick turned fully toward her. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the delicate line of her cheekbones. She opened her eyes, and in them, he saw the same desperate, consuming hunger that was clawing at his own chest. It was not a hunger for love. It was a desperate need to feel something other than the crushing weight of betrayal. It was a need to reclaim power, to dirty themselves in the same mud their spouses wallowed in, to balance the unbearable equation. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was a collision of teeth and ragged breath, a chaotic, bruising testament to their shared agony. Imelda responded with a fierce, unexpected intensity, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, deeper into the abyss. They fell back against the velvet cushions, the tea mugs rattling precariously on the table. There was no tenderness in the way he unfastened her robe, nor in the way she pulled at his shirt. It was a raw, primal transaction, two drowning people clinging to each other in the dark, using their bodies as weapons against the ghosts of their marriages. As Garrick buried his face in the crook of her neck, the scent of chamomile giving way to the salt of her skin, a terrifying realization bloomed in the back of his mind. They had crossed the line. They were no longer the victims standing on the moral high ground. They had become the monsters they were trying to destroy. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the minimalist kitchen of their apartment. It was past midnight, the rain outside having settled into a steady, miserable drizzle against the large windows overlooking the dark sprawl of Prague. Garrick sat at the marble island, a glass of water untouched before him, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. He was reviewing the secondary stress models for the bridge, the real ones, the ones that proved the polymer matrix would ultimately fail under the winter ice floes. The soft padding of bare feet on the hardwood floor broke his concentration. Leora stood in the doorway, the hallway light casting a soft, golden halo around her. She was wearing one of his old, oversized university sweatshirts, her hair down and messy. She didn't look like the sharp, commanding urban planner who had effortlessly navigated city budgets and a secret lover. She looked fragile, almost hauntingly similar to the woman he had married 7 years ago. "You're working late again," she said softly, walking over to the island and sitting on the stool next to him. She didn't look at the screen, only at his profile. "The bridge is taking everything out of you." Garrick closed the laptop with a quiet click, the sudden darkness of the screen a small act of self-preservation. "The timeline is aggressive," he replied evenly, his voice devoid of the sharp edges it usually carried. "I need to ensure the load paths are secure before the solstice gala." Leora reached out, her fingertips lightly brushing the back of his hand resting on the marble. Her touch was hesitant, lacking the assuredness she possessed in every other aspect of her life. "Garrick," she began, her voice dropping into a register of vulnerability he hadn't heard in months. I feel like we're ghosts living in the same house. We used to talk about everything. Now, we just talk about stone and mortar." He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her dark eyes were pools of genuine distress, a stark contrast to the hollow perfection she projected during the day. For a terrifying, suspended second, Garrick felt a sharp tug in his chest, a phantom ache from the love that used to anchor him to this woman. The impulse to pull her into his arms, to demand the truth, to beg her to explain why she had torn them apart, surged up his throat like bile. "We are busy, Leora," he managed to say, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "The project is consuming us both." "Is it just the project?" she pressed, her fingers wrapping gently around his. "Sometimes I look at you, and I feel like you're 1,000 miles away. I know I haven't been present. I know I've been consumed by this bridge, by Julian's demands." Hearing his name from her lips in this context, framed as an overbearing client rather than a lover, was a brutal, visceral shock. It was a masterclass in deception, a lie so deeply ingrained she delivered it with the earnest face of a neglected wife. The momentary softness in Garrick's chest instantly calcified into something hard and unforgiving. He looked down at their joined hands. This was the woman who had gasped another man's name in a cheap apartment. This was the woman who was currently leveraging his professional expertise to fund her affair. "It's just the stress, Leora," Garrick said slowly, meticulously constructing his lie. He squeezed her hand back, a cold, calculated gesture. "Once the bridge is stable, once the gala is over, we will take some time. We will figure this out." Leora let out a long, shuddering breath, a visible release of tension. She leaned forward and rested her head against his shoulder, her jasmine perfume filling his senses, mixing with the phantom scent of Imelda's chamomile that still clung to his memory. "Thank you," she whispered into the fabric of his shirt. "I love you, Garrick." "I know," he replied quietly, staring blankly at the dark window pane. The weight of her head on his shoulder felt heavier than any stone he had ever analyzed. She was reaching out to him, perhaps out of genuine regret, or perhaps out of the crushing guilt of her own secret. It didn't matter. The foundation of their marriage was already utterly compromised. Garrick realized then that he was not just building a trap for Leora. He was building a tomb for whatever was left of his own humanity. The air in the city planning office was thick, practically humming with the kind of frantic energy that preceded a major structural failure. It had been 3 weeks since Garrick and Leora had sat at their kitchen island. 3 weeks since Garrick had quietly authorized the massive, non-refundable order for the German rapid-setting polymer. Garrick stood near the frosted glass of Leora's private office, a rolled-up set of revised blueprints tucked under his arm. He didn't need to knock. He could hear the sharp, uncharacteristic elevation in her voice through the heavy door. "What do you mean the secondary funding tier is frozen, Julian?" Leora's voice was a tight wire, snapping with anxiety. "You guaranteed those funds for the aesthetic masonry. We have media teams scheduled for the Solstice Gala in exactly 14 days. If the upper arches look like a war zone, the mayor will personally see to my resignation." Garrick pressed his back against the wall, listening to the muffled, frustrated baritone of Julian on speakerphone. "I don't know what the hell is happening, Leora," Julian snapped back, the polished veneer of the wealthy developer entirely stripped away. "My CFO called this morning. The capital I had liquid in the Cayman accounts was suddenly tied up in a series of obscure, aggressive collateral holds initiated by my own wife's trust. Imelda's signature is on the authorizations, but she claims her financial manager handled it as standard diversification." Garrick smiled, a cold, humorless curvature of his lips. Imelda had executed her part perfectly. By leveraging her substantial, prenuptial family trust to aggressively block Julian's offshore liquidity, she had effectively severed the financial artery feeding the bridge's cosmetic phase. "Standard diversification?" Leora hissed, pacing the length of her office, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood. "Julian, We are 3 million euros in the hole for a polymer that your own firm demanded we use to expedite the timeline. You need to fix this. You need to talk to Imelda. I can't just interrogate my wife about her trust fund right now, Leora. She's been fragile lately. Distant, Julian growled, his voice dropping into a register of paranoid frustration. Look, just stall the contractors. Tell them there's a supply chain issue with the masonry stone. I'll liquidate some domestic assets by the end of the week. You can't liquidate domestic assets without the board noticing, Leora shot back, the panic rising in her throat. Julian, if this stalls, the city auditors will start digging into why we shifted the budget in the first place. They'll look at the structural approvals. Garrick signed off on them, Julian pointed out, a cruel, dismissive edge to his tone. Your husband's name is on the line, not yours. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a sickening realization. Garrick could almost see the color draining from Leora's face on the other side of the glass. Don't you dare put this on Garrick, Leora whispered, her voice trembling. He compromised his professional integrity because I asked him to. Because you needed the timeline accelerated. I didn't hold a gun to his head, Leora. He's the engineer. He made the call. Julian paused, a heavy sigh crackling through the phone speaker. I have to go. I'll meet you at the apartment at 4. We need to figure this out. The line went dead. Garrick waited 30 seconds, letting his breathing steady, before he pushed open the heavy oak door. Leora was standing by her desk, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked up, her dark eyes wide and terrified, a stark contrast to the brilliant, in-control woman she usually portrayed. Garrick, she gasped, her voice fragile. She released the desk and took a step toward him. I was just on the phone with Julian. There's a problem with the funding for the upper masonry. I know, Garrick said calmly, unrolling the blueprints and spreading them across her desk, covering the frantic notes she had been scribbling. I received an email from his CFO 20 minutes ago. The cosmetic phase is halted indefinitely. Garrick, what are we going to do? Leora asked, her facade completely shattering. She reached out and grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his forearm through his jacket. If the city finds out the bridge isn't visually ready for the gala, they'll investigate the budget reallocation. They'll look at the polymer. Garrick looked down at her hand, then up into her panicked eyes. This was the moment she had engineered for herself. She was begging the husband she was betraying to save her from the consequences of pleasing her lover. We are going to do exactly what the blueprints dictate, Leora, Garrick said quietly, his voice a smooth, cold stone dropping into deep water. We are going to open the bridge. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving her alone with the blueprints, the silence, and the terrifying realization that the foundation beneath her feet had already begun to crumble. We fixed the bridge, Leora, but we let ourselves collapse into the river. The rain had returned to Prague, washing the cobblestone streets in a slick, black sheen. Inside the closed cafe, the air was heavy with the smell of stale roasted beans and a sharp, metallic tang of impending destruction. The only illumination came from a single pendant light hanging above Imelda's small wooden table, casting long, dramatic shadows against the brick walls. Garrick sat perfectly still, staring at the thick stack of parchment resting on the table. It was the final oversight approval for the Charles Bridge restoration. Beside the documents sat his heavy brass engineering seal, the physical manifestation of his integrity, his career, and his reputation. He bought her a necklace, Imelda said quietly, breaking the suffocating silence. She was standing by the darkened window, looking out at the rain. She held a glass of amber scotch, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. A sapphire pendant. He charged it to a secondary offshore account, but my forensic accountant flagged the withdrawal this morning. He told me the account was drained to cover the bridge's masonry deficit. She turned around, stepping into the pool of dim light. Her eyes, once soft and melancholic, were now bottomless and cold. The transformation was absolute. She walked over to the table, setting her glass down, and placed her pale hand flat on the final page of the document. This is the waiver, isn't it? She asked, her voice a steady, hollow whisper. Garrick looked at the page beneath her hand. Yes, it's an emergency authorization. It explicitly states that the lead urban planner, Leora, mandated the use of the rapid-setting polymer matrix to expedite the timeline, overriding standard structural recommendations. And if you stamp it? Imelda pressed, leaning closer. If I stamp it, I legitimize her override, Garrick explained, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. I am technically approving the safety, but the liability for the material swap shifts entirely to her office. When the polymer fractures under the winter ice, the city's forensic engineers will pull this file. They will see that she bypassed a 600-year-old curing protocol to satisfy a private developer's financial schedule. It will not just be a firing offense. It will be classified as criminal negligence. Imelda stared at the heavy brass seal. She did not flinch at the mention of criminal charges. The woman who used to gently remind him to breathe, who used to find solace in soft jazz and warm pastries, had been burned away by Julian's deceit. Julian's firm will be audited alongside her, Imelda noted, a dark satisfaction creeping into her tone. With his liquidity frozen by my trust, he won't be able to buy his way out of the city's lawsuits. He will lose the firm. He will lose everything. Garrick picked up the brass seal. The metal was cold against his palm. For a fleeting, agonizing second, the ghost of his marriage flashed before his eyes. Leora laughing on their honeymoon, the way she used to look at him before the ambition and the secrets hollowed them out. He thought of her panicked eyes in the office just days ago, begging him to fix the mess she had created. Then, the phantom scent of her cheap hotel room crashed over him, suffocating the mercy in his chest. Once I press this, Imelda, there is no going back, Garrick said, his voice dropping into a gravelly whisper. We are committing a felony. If they ever trace the polymer failure back to my intentional sabotage, I will go to prison with them. Imelda moved around the table. She stood behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, her cheek resting against his. She guided his hand, her slender fingers wrapping over his knuckles as he gripped the heavy brass stamp. We are already in a prison, Garrick, she whispered into his ear, her breath warm against his skin. Let them burn with us. Together, they pressed the seal down. The heavy thud of the brass stamping the red ink onto the crisp white paper echoed through the empty cafe like the dropping of a guillotine blade. The point of no return had been crossed. The bridge was doomed, and so were they. The Summer Solstice Gala was a masterclass in Prague's high society illusion. Held in the grand, gilded ballroom of the Municipal House, just a short carriage ride from the Charles Bridge, the event was a suffocating display of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and strategic smiles. The city's elite had gathered to celebrate the completion of the bridge's structural phase, a milestone that, officially, was a triumph of engineering and urban planning. Garrick stood near the towering arched windows overlooking the Vltava River. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing the dark water and the silhouette of the bridge in the distance. He wore a sharply tailored tuxedo that felt more like armor than formal wear. He nursed a glass of scotch, watching the room with the clinical detachment of a man observing a controlled demolition. Across the ballroom, Leora was holding court with the mayor and several key members of the city council. She looked breathtaking in a deep emerald gown that accentuated her dark hair, her posture impeccably straight, her smile radiant and completely false. She was selling the success of the rapid-setting polymer to the politicians, masking the terrified reality that the upper masonry, the aesthetic crown jewel Julian had promised, was currently replaced by temporary scaffolding due to his frozen funds. Garrick's eyes drifted to Julian. The developer was standing near the grand staircase, nursing a bourbon and looking distinctly unraveled. His usual arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a tight, paranoid energy. He kept glancing at Leora, then at his phone, his thumbs swiping incessantly. The financial hemorrhage orchestrated by Imelda was bleeding him dry, and the stress was eroding his polished facade. He looks like a man standing on a trapdoor, a soft voice murmured beside Garrick. Imelda materialized next to him, slipping her arm through his with practiced ease. She was wearing a stunning, understated silver dress that caught the light of the chandeliers. To anyone watching, they were simply two colleagues sharing a quiet moment away from the crowd. But beneath the surface, the air between them was crackling with the dark electricity of their shared secret. "The trapdoor opens on Monday," Garrick replied, keeping his voice perfectly level, his eyes never leaving Julian. "When the city's independent auditors arrive to review the final invoices and the safety authorizations." Imelda took a delicate sip of her champagne. "My financial manager confirmed the final transfer block this afternoon." Julian tried to liquidate his secondary stock portfolio to cover the masonry contractors. "I froze it under the pretense of a suspicious marital asset review." She smiled, a small, chilling upward curve of her lips that did not reach her melancholic eyes. It was the smile of a woman who had finally learned how to wield her own grief as a weapon. "Leora is terrified," Garrick noted, watching his wife laugh at a joke the mayor made. The sound was hollow, brittle, lacking its usual warmth. "She knows the contractors are threatening to walk. She knows the scaffolding looks like a failure to the press. But she thinks she still has control. She thinks the foundation is secure. And when she realizes it isn't?" Imelda asked, turning her head slightly to look at him. "She will look for the flaw in the design," Garrick said, his tone dropping into a cold, mechanical register. "And she will find her own signature on the authorization, legally binding her to the material swap she demanded to save Julian's timeline." The string quartet in the corner of the ballroom began to play a sweeping waltz. The mayor tapped his glass, signaling the beginning of the formal speeches. Julian straightened his tie and began moving toward the podium, preparing to deliver a speech about historical preservation and corporate responsibility, a grotesque parody of the truth. As Julian began to speak, his voice echoing through the gilded hall, Garrick felt Leora's eyes lock onto him from across the room. There was a desperate, silent plea in her gaze, a plea for reassurance, for the solid, dependable husband she thought she had manipulated into submission. Garrick held her gaze. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply raised his glass of scotch in a slow, deliberate toast, a silent acknowledgement of the ruin they had all meticulously constructed together. The waltz swelled, the applause thundered, and beneath it all, the invisible cracks in the foundation finally reached critical mass. The applause following Julian's speech had barely faded into the gilded ceiling of the municipal house when the heavy mahogany doors of the private VIP anteroom clicked shut, sealing them inside. The contrast to the ballroom was stark. No sweeping waltzes, no clinking champagne glasses, just the suffocating, deafening silence of a reckoning. Present in the room were Leora, Julian, Garrick, and Imelda, alongside Mayor Havel and the city's lead forensic auditor, a stern, gray-haired man named Merrick. "I apologize for pulling you away from the celebration," Merrick stated, his voice devoid of the party's earlier warmth. He dropped a thick, heavy leather binder onto the center of the glass table. The thud made Leora flinch. "However, the city council received a highly classified, expedited dossier this afternoon regarding the Charles Bridge restoration. We have a catastrophic problem." Julian let out a tight, arrogant scoff, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo. "Whatever budgetary discrepancies you think you've found, Merrick, my firm can cover them by Monday morning. This is highly inappropriate." "Your firm cannot cover a parking ticket, Julian." Imelda spoke up, her voice slicing through the room like a silver blade. She stepped out from the shadows near the velvet curtains, her eyes locked on her husband. "Your domestic accounts are frozen. Your Cayman liquidity has been permanently locked under a hostile asset review initiated by my trust." Julian, the color completely drained from his face. "Imelda, what have you done? You can't do that." "I did it to stop you from hemorrhaging my family's money to fund your mistress's construction timeline," Imelda replied smoothly, the word mistress dropping into the room with the weight of a live grenade. Mayor Havel closed his eyes in deep disgust. Leora let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, taking a stumbling step backward. Her dark eyes darted frantically from Imelda to Julian, and finally, to Garrick. Garrick stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. His face was a mask of carved stone. He did not look away. The financial fraud is a civil matter, Merrick continued, his tone turning clinical and merciless. He opened the binder and slid a single sheet of paper toward Leora. It was the emergency authorization. The criminal matter is this. You bypassed a 600-year-old curing protocol to appease a bankrupt developer. You mandated the use of a rapid-setting polymer matrix. According to the stress simulations run by my office 3 hours ago, that polymer will completely fracture when the winter ice floes hit the central piers. Leora stared at the document, her hands beginning to tremble violently. No, she whispered, panic rapidly stripping away her commanding aura. No, Garrick approved this. Look at the stamp. He is the lead engineer. He signed off on the safety parameters. She looked at her husband, expecting him to step forward, to defend her, to take the shield as he always did. Garrick stepped into the light, but there was no salvation in his eyes. I stamped the authorization based on your direct, documented mandate as the lead urban planner, Leora, he said, his voice a flat, dead calm that chilled the marrow of her bones. You provided the budget. You dictated the timeline. I merely calculated the load path for the inferior material you forced upon the project. Read the liability waiver. It explicitly places the burden of the material swap entirely on your office. Leora looked down at the paper. Her own signature stared back at her, a legally binding death warrant for her career and her freedom. The pieces violently snapped together in her mind. The missing funds. The sudden agreement to use the polymer. The cold, distant compliance of her husband over the past month. He knew. You, she breathed out, her voice breaking into a ragged sob as her legs gave out. She sank heavily into one of the leather chairs, clutching the edge of the glass table to keep from collapsing completely. You set me up. You knew everything. I built exactly what you asked for, Leora, Garrick replied, looking down at the shattered remains of the woman he used to love. A structure that looked beautiful on the surface, but was completely rotten underneath. Merrick closed the binder. Leora, your credentials are suspended indefinitely, pending a criminal investigation for gross negligence. Julian, you will be served with a breach of contract lawsuit by the city tomorrow morning. Garrick watched Leora bury her face in her trembling hands, the emerald gown suddenly looking like a heavy, tragic shroud. There was no surge of triumph in his chest, no warm vindication. As Julian began to shout desperate, broken pleas at Imelda, Garrick felt nothing but a cold, echoing emptiness. The demolition was a perfect success, leaving nothing but dust. The morning after the gala, Prague was swallowed by a dense, unyielding fog rolling off the Vltava River. It clung to the Gothic spires and the wet cobblestones, muffling the sounds of a city waking up. The air was biting, carrying the sharp scent of damp stone and exhaust. Garrick stood alone on the edge of the construction site, near the city-rented apartment where his reality had fractured exactly 5 weeks ago. The temporary scaffolding around the Charles Bridge looked like the ribs of a decaying leviathan in the gray light. The project was officially frozen. Yellow tape fluttered uselessly against the stone pillars. Behind him, the heavy door of the site office clicked open. Imelda stepped out into the cold, pulling a thick cashmere coat tightly around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, her pale blonde hair swept back, dark circles bruising the delicate skin under her eyes. The frantic, manic energy that had sustained her through the sabotage was gone, leaving only a profound, hollow stillness. Julian's lawyers called my firm at dawn, she said, stopping a few feet away from him. Her voice barely carried over the sound of the rushing water below. He is liquidating his remaining personal assets to avoid immediate jail time. He asked me for an advance on the divorce settlement. I hung up. Garrick didn't look at her immediately. He kept his eyes on the fractured central arch of the bridge. Leora packed a single suitcase and left for her mother's house in Brno. He replied, his tone flat and even. The city council formally stripped her of her urban planning license this morning. The criminal negligence hearing is set for next month. The silence that settled between them was heavy, not with unspoken desire or shared trauma, but with the cold finality of their actions. They had achieved exactly what they set out to do. They had burned down the lives of the people who betrayed them, leaving nothing but ash and legal ruin. Imelda took a slow step forward, reaching out to lightly touch his arm. Her fingers were freezing. "We did it, Garrick," she whispered, looking up at his rigid profile. "We did," he agreed, finally turning to meet her gaze. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Garrick searched her eyes for the spark of the connection they had forged in the dark, the desperate, bruising intimacy that had fueled their revenge. But there was nothing left. The fire they had started had consumed their enemies, and in the process, it had burned away the oxygen they needed to survive together. They were mirrors reflecting the same grotesque monster back at each other. They were not lovers. They were accomplices. Imelda slowly pulled her hand back, her melancholic smile returning, tinged with a tragic understanding. "I'm moving back to Vienna," she said softly, clutching her coat tighter. "I need to be away from this city, away from this river." "It's for the best," Garrick nodded, a heavy sense of closure settling in his chest. "Take care of yourself, Imelda." She didn't say goodbye. She simply turned and walked away, her silhouette slowly dissolving into the thick Prague fog until she was completely gone. Garrick was alone. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and reached into his inner pocket, pulling out a rolled set of the original Charles Bridge blueprints, the ones Leora had so eagerly marked up with Julian's accelerated timeline. He unrolled them onto a flat, damp stone parapet overlooking the water. The intricate ink lines detailed a structure built to withstand centuries, now compromised by greed and betrayal. Slowly, Garrick raised his left hand. The gold wedding band felt foreign, a heavy shackle he had worn for 7 years. He gripped the ring, twisting it past his knuckle, feeling a sharp, phantom pain as it slid off his finger. He placed the gold band deliberately in the center of the blueprints, right over the flawed load path of the main arch. It was a final, silent calculation, the weight of the ring against the fragile paper. Garrick turned his back on the blueprints, the bridge, and the ruins of his marriage. He began to walk down the cobblestone path, his heavy boots making soft thuds that echoed in the mist. He had won the war, but the battlefield was his own life. "We fixed the bridge, Leora, but we let ourselves collapse into the river,"